Hello there, Leo listeners. Cara here from leolistening.com, where I help adventurous expats and intrepid travelers improve their English listening skills so they can fit in better with native speakers. And something I'm trying to do going forward is talk to more people about their experiences of living abroad, and also people who are experts in helping English learners improve their English for living abroad and fitting in with native speakers. So I'm really pleased to welcome back Leandra to Leo Listening. If you've been here for a long time and you have a really good memory, then you will remember Leandra. But I think for most people, they will need an introduction. So Leandra, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, hi guys. Good to be back and good to be here now for the first time for some of you who are now watching. My name is Leandra King and I run EnglishWithLeandra.com. So I am a native English speaker. You might notice that I have an accent that's different to Cara's. I'm actually from the island of Barbados, in the Caribbean. It's not as glorified as everybody thinks it is, but it's quite nice here. And yes, we are native speakers here. So I'm very passionate about foreign languages, and actually that's how I met Cara, through that forum. And they've had a huge impact on my life, both personally and professionally.
Okay, yeah, because the last time that we spoke, you talked about your experiences living in France.
Well, Martinique, yeah.
Yeah, in Martinique, which is part of,
right.
in the Caribbean, but part of
yes.
France. That was a bit strange, but it really is part of France. So
it is, yeah.
You have to obviously speak French and adapt to French culture. So yeah, we discussed that. And so I think on English with Leandra, you're more focused on helping people learning English to do the kind of the opposite, which is fit in with native English speakers and speaking cultures.
Right, exactly. So what I basically did was that I used my experience when I was overseas. I had such a hard time fitting in at first that when I started to do English with Leandra, I wanted to find an area that I could really hone in on and focus on. And I thought, why not polite English? Because, I know of the tons of mistakes that I've made in French and being perceived as maybe rude when, it wasn't my intention to be rude. So that's what I wanted to focus on for English with Leandra, polite English in terms of helping them, polite English with the view of fitting in, fitting in with native English speakers. And it's basically for those who already have such a good command of the English language, but they want to make sure that they're being well received and they're not making any unnecessary impolite faux pas, as they're speaking with native English speakers. So for persons who maybe they work with native English speakers, and actually they might still be in their home country, but they interact with native English speakers maybe on Skype, or they're in a work setting, or maybe they've moved to the actual country and they do interact with native English speakers. All of these individuals would, benefit from learning how to be a bit more polite in English.
Okay, so basically any interaction with native speakers, whether it's from your home country or if you're living abroad, or maybe in a third country, there's all kinds of scenarios.
Exactly.
You're concerned. All right, so stick with us if that's your situation, and even if not, actually, even if you maybe go to English speaking countries a bit less, maybe because you're traveling, it's
exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you don't want to be perceived as the rude tourist. So what are some typical mistakes then that people? So your English is not your first language. You've learned it. Okay, we both have learned French. What are some mistakes then that people make when interacting with native English speakers? When does communication break down and people get considered as rude?
Right. So you might tend to notice it. Well, generally in most interactions, you're gonna have stuff coming up. So even as you're moving to a new country, you have to tackle the admin process. You're doing that in a new language. But then on the socializing spectrum, knowing how to correctly behave around native speakers, how to converse, what to say, what to do, sometimes we can get into that a bit later of even how persons who already have such a great command of the language can still be perceived as rude. But sometimes what some non-native English speakers tend to do is that they would take what they know in their language and then apply it to English. And that doesn't always work because sometimes it could come across as very direct. Whereas, native English speakers, we tend to be, even though we all have our different cultures, you're from Europe, I'm from the Caribbean, you have persons from North America. We still tend to, you find English language tends to beat around the bush a lot more. We tend to soften things a lot more. So, it's better received by persons. So sometimes non-native English speakers might make this mistake because they're not aware of those like cultural differences. So yeah, that's one of the things that comes to mind readily, the direct approach, and that's just applying what they know from their native tongue to the English language.
Okay, so basically like directly translating something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Have Even you got in the way they say it as well, direct translation, and also maybe their body language as well.
Okay.
Because they would take that from there, and each culture has their own way of expressing the gestures, the facial expressions. One thing in one language could mean something, and it could mean something else in a different language. So all of these components you kind of have to take into consideration.
Okay. So have you got like an example of where something that's too direct for a native English speaker and that would be considered rude? And how would you soften it to make it a bit more acceptable? Like, is it things like requests or?
Yeah, exactly. And also I should preface this by saying that it also depends on, whom you're speaking to, because if you know somebody in a more intimate setting, you can get away with certain things. And also there are certain things, for example, that persons might say, even native English speakers, and they can get away with it because even if it's direct, because of their intonation, because that actually plays a huge role. And sometimes that's something that some non-native English speakers are unaware of. So your intonation does play a huge role as well. But in terms of, as you were saying, making requests, like if you just say, like, give me that, and you just add please, or, at the end of it, some persons think, okay, maybe just saying please is good enough. I've added please, I've softened it a bit. But then you would notice that as, I don't know, for me, I speak about myself personally, I tend to use the modal verbs, could you hand it to me, please? You can still use the please, but using the could. Would you mind handing that to me, please? Like, usually the person is not going to say, yes, I mind, because... But we just feel this need to ask for like permission to help. Like, could you, like, you're going beyond just, the person is likely going to help you, but you still want to soften it. And it is especially important when you're dealing in certain professional settings. And like I said, when you, maybe with your spouse or whatever, you can get away with certain things in terms of, because I'm sure like when I'm speaking to my husband, I would use sometimes direct commands. So that's fine, like in those situations, but especially when you're in a professional setting, or you're speaking with persons with whom you're not that familiar, using those modal verbs could go a long way in terms of how you're perceived.
Okay, so it's probably a safer option to take your direct request and just make it a bit more polite. So could you do this? Would you mind? And like you say, there's a good distinction there between like the literal meaning. Like, we know the person doesn't mind. We know that in 99% of cases, yes, exactly. they will give me that pen.
Exactly. Because it's such like a small act.
Exactly. Yeah, you're not asking like, could you give me your car keys or your house? I'm good. Something big like this. But yeah, no, that's a good point. And so it shows how, we don't communicate politeness in the same way, and how like the literal meaning and the need to use it for politeness, is something a bit different. And you make a good point about between friends. I'm sure like the way I talk to my friends could sound very rude, but I think you make a good point about intonation, because maybe we say things and we make it sarcastic or we make it funny.
Exactly.
We can take the same phrase and we can give it a lot of different meanings, like you say, just with our tone and intonation plus the body language. So yeah, two friends talking could sound quite different to a boss and a colleague
Right.
chatting. But yeah, no, that's something that my partner says to me a lot. Like, he says, you can't use that word in public, you can't say that, you could, but I'm like, I say that to you all the time. And he just makes the point, your language is too informal now for people you don't know. And I'm just like, well, I just assumed everybody used that word, and it was just like an informal word but not offensive. So yeah, you have to sometimes be careful about the setting where you learn something, because it won't always translate.
It will translate as well, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you think you still need to be careful that, like, once you get to the stage where you're making friends, what should you do? Should you still use the modal verbs and the softeners, or can you start trying to like copy them? Or what do you think?
Well, I think it depends too, because every level of friendship is different. There's some people you're just really close with, and sometimes depending on how they speak, you might reflect that. So if they're very informal people, you might tend to be very informal with them. So I think maybe mirroring what your friend does, but then like we said, that's in a friend setting, but we don't want to mirror, okay, so if the boss speaks to you in a particular way, you cannot then speak back to the boss in that way, because obviously there's a authority,
a hierarchy
above you. Exactly. And you have to still respect him. So while he might get away with saying certain things to you in a more, direct way, then if you say back, then that's a bit where a challenge might come now. But with friends, I would say, as you start to feel your way, you could mirror what they, and also like we said at the end of the day, it comes down to intonation, because we can take the same sentence and just say it different ways, and it will be perceived differently. And you said body language. So I think if we only look at the language component, like, it might become challenging, because a person might, even let's say that they say use the modal verbs, but then they still say in a very like direct way, and the intonation isn't as, I don't know, maybe don't soften it as much in terms of their intonation, then I think that could still kind of pose a problem.
Yeah, maybe not using like question intonation, like,
right,
or something like that. Yeah, so there could be miscommunication there. Well, I'm seeing loads of opportunities to use movies and TV shows then to get an idea of, to observe the situations before you go. This is something I talk about a lot. Like, instead of just like, well, I'll just figure it out when I get there. No, you can take a bit of time before to observe how people interact and what is acceptable in different situations. I guess you would agree with that.
Yeah, I think I've done that as well to some extent, because, even if you're living in the country, persons might not tell you, like, okay, we were talking about a situation before, and you were saying how, the husband looked at the wife, this was before we were recording, the husband looked at the wife, a certain way, like, why is she saying certain things? But you don't always get somebody giving you that feedback. You might just realize persons are not interacting with you the same way, or you don't have a certain relationship with them. But when you pay attention, like you said, to the movies, you can look and see, okay, this is how I'm supposed to, or get an idea, a gauge of how you're supposed to kind of interact in certain situations, and then use that, because you might not always get the feedback, unfortunately. Somebody might not come out and tell you, well, you're being rude, or, So
well, it would be considered rude, I think, in most English-speaking countries, in most situations, to say to somebody, that was really rude, how dare you. I mean, unless you really offend the person, because you're like shouting at them, or you're verbally violent. But I think in most situations people will say afterwards, like, oh, that's so
like, so not like internalizing, and then in turn they change the way they interact with you. So you might start to notice a bit of coolness, or just they're different in how they interact with you. But you're right, we usually would not, that goes against what the whole polite English, we would not want to say, because we tend to beat around the bush. Like, it's so remarkable, because like sometimes we know exactly what we want to say, but then we spend like a million years trying to formulate it and say okay, maybe this isn't polite enough. Let me change this up. Or even in terms of writing emails, you sit on your okay, like, no, maybe I need to change this here. And we spend so much time like going over what we say, and it just goes to show like the importance of this aspect of polite English that maybe a lot of non-native English speakers might not be actually thinking about.
True. Yeah, no, I've definitely agonized over emails, especially if you're asking for something like difficult or it's a request that could get refused. Yeah, you have to really think
Yeah.
about it before you send it. Yeah, written language is a whole other domain because you don't have the nonverbal cues. I mean, and emails are terrible. Like, I think a lot of emails cause a lot of upset to people because
You can't hear how the person said it.
yeah, sometimes when I get like really short emails or things that seem really direct, like I think the person is trying to save time. I'm like, why haven't they
Yeah.
put like a really nice email from? Or when people don't even put like your name at the top and they just
Right.
put like an instant message. Like I still don't think we've really figured out the rules for
Yeah, I know.
communicating clearly in emails, and I think now it's maybe just getting worse with like instant messaging.
Yeah, because people want to just go do things, and I've been actually guilty of that on both ends. Like, for example, this morning I wrote a really nice email, and I was there thinking, okay, maybe I should word it this way for competition that I'm running locally. And I write this whole long email, and then she just responds, okay, thanks, I'll share it. And I'm like, what? Like, that's it. Like, I wrote this whole thing trying to figure out, okay, let me change this word. And I spent so much time agonizing about it, you know? So it just goes to show like non-native speakers that even for native English speakers, sometimes it's still this challenge, you know, in terms of how you put over something so you're not perceived as rude.
Yeah, it's funny that about expectations. I think that plays a big role. Like, so you wrote something and you were really careful with it, and maybe you're expecting a response that's just as carefully thought out. Or yeah, you're kind of, and then in the end, oh, okay, and then you're like, well, maybe I didn't have to write all that, or
Right, exactly.
it's really hard to. I think that any kind of communication where you're not face to face is a lot harder, especially if it's written. Do you think that's true then, even of like a phone conversation? Do we have to be a bit more careful? Like, I'm thinking conference calls, phone calls, even this type of call. I mean, you know, sometimes people do it without the video. So in fact, there is no nonverbal communication.
Yeah, I think that's really hard to read. You know, when you don't have the facial cues to read, you know, how the person is perceiving it. Yeah, that can be quite challenging. And I mean, even sometimes when persons, or I wonder if they pick up on certain cues because, for example, I remember I've done like video calls like this one, and with non-native English speakers. And it was at that point, it reminded me that they were non-native English speakers, because even though we would have communicated quite well in email because they had a really good command of the English language, I found in terms of their gesture, their verbal cue, their body language, actually, it was not what I would have expected. Like, you know, as we're speaking, we nod, you know, you acknowledge what the person is saying. There's certain things that you do. And then there were certain points at times during the call when I noticed that they would have said certain things that were quite off. And it was at that time, like, it kind of reminded me that they're non-native speakers, because I find what happens is that when you get really good at a language, and for example, let's say your accent is quite neutral, so persons don't hear your native accent interfering as much, people sometimes tend to forget, oh, well, you know, she's a non-native speaker. So because they don't have like the grammar mistakes that you're making anymore to like hear. So then I find in those situations when you're impolite, it shows up a lot more, because, you know, you don't have that, okay, well, you're making a ton of grammatical mistakes, you're fumbling over your words, because you can say it quite smoothly. Then persons tend to hear the rudeness a lot more, I find.
That's interesting, yeah, because you definitely get a pass in more concessions if your level is lower, because it's very clear that it's not your native language. Yeah, whereas you're quite right, at higher levels, you know, it's more noticeable. So that is a really good general point then. So because what you're saying is basically you can have perfect or, you know, very good grammar, vocabulary, sentence structure, pronunciation, but still be perceived as rude, offend people,
Exactly.
miscommunicate. Yeah.
Yeah. Persons are definitely going to notice it a lot more because you don't have those, like when you're fumbling over your words, persons are just trying to help you communicate and get the
Yeah.
words out.
Yeah. And they don't care if you're accidentally rude. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
But then when you have like your English is like flawless and you have such a big grasp on the English language, the grammar is on point, the wide vocabulary, then it's at those times that you start to notice, like I remember like when I was on a conference call a time and, the young lady, she asked me, what did you say? But it was how she said it. It kind of like took me aback. I was taken aback by it for a little while because it was not necessarily, obviously she wanted me to repeat what I said, but it was like a harsh, it's like, what? What did you say? And I was like, so then I remember like, oh my goodness, she's not native. Like I forgot for a moment, like speaking to her that she was. And like something like that, like I brought it to her attention after because obviously this is my area as an English teacher. But let's say we were in a normal setting and I didn't know her in that way. I would not have said anything. I'm like, oh my goodness, this girl's so rude. Like, why is she speaking to me like that? So it's just, when you, like we were saying, when you already have such a big grasp, you really have to be on point with it because, you don't have as many excuses because persons are already kind of viewing you almost as a native speaker.
Yeah.
So sometimes it might tend to forget that, that's not your native language when you make those sort of mistakes because they might figure, well, okay, she's been learning English for so long, she should know how to, interact in a polite way by now.
Yeah. Yeah, even if it's something you don't really get explicitly taught at school or at university. I certainly don't remember learning about that in French. And then obviously you go to the country, as we both have, and you suddenly learn very quickly.
Yeah.
Because in France, it's some of the very basic things that are really important, like saying bonjour when you go into a shop, into the bakery, when you see your neighbor on the stairwell, at work, you have to say that all the time, all day long, to everybody that you see. And that's like a really basic word that you learn, and you learn that it's the equivalent of hello, but you can easily in an English speaking country go into a shop and not say hello.
Yeah, that's actually something I struggle with because I'm from the Caribbean, we tend to, if we're passing persons on the street, we would say hello. So that's pretty standard for here. But what isn't standard is just going into a regular shop and saying bonjour to anybody, because I remember, for example, when I went to a store, it was like a boutique or something like that, like a clothing store, yeah. And, I was just going in, I'm thinking, okay, well, the cashier is like all the way at the end, like, why am I gonna, say hello?
Yeah. At this point,
and then as soon as I got in the store, they said it, and I'm like, what's up with that? And I didn't necessarily say it back because I was really shy, and I'm like, okay, why are these people like just saying that? But then I realized like every time I go into a place, they would say. So that's something I had to get over to remember. Okay, when you go into this store, you need to say this.
You say bonjour. And it's also it's funny as well how you can use it like a weapon. It's like if you didn't say bonjour loud enough or clear enough, people, they can take it bad. It can become a bit of a weapon. I see that in the building I live, there's a lot of older people, but they always say to me bonjour madame, and I mean that is very polite, but I actually think sometimes they try to be too polite, and they're sort of using it against you. If you just say bonjour, and they'll be bonjour madame, as in you should have called me madame because I'm 75. I probably should. I don't want to be rude to these people, but I also don't want to weaponize my bonjour. But yeah, maybe I should make an effort with the older people to be more respectful and say monsieur, madame, because it's ridiculous when they say it to me and I'm half their age or something. Anyway, these are the details that you learn. But to come back to that, what did you say? An expression like "what did you say" or "I beg your pardon" is really interesting because you could use that in an accusatory way, which it sounds like the person you were speaking to did. What did you say? Like, if someone does say something rude to you, you might say that back, as in, you know,
right.
How dare you say that to me? I beg your pardon. Like, you know, I know I've just been insulted, and now I'm questioning you about it. So, like, yeah, it's interesting how, like, that one simple phrase, there's a whole range of ways you could say it, and a whole range of meanings you could communicate. Oh, it sounds very complicated.
What made it so worse was like the what. Like, so she paused like after the what and then continued the sentence. So it's like, what? And then the expression on her face was like, I know she was just trying to ask me to repeat it, but it was such a strong what that, you know, it had me for the well, like, okay.
You know, what so, what did I say? Like, how did I offend you?
Yeah. So, you know, like, you know, and something else I was thinking about in terms of, you know, being politically correct, you know, because for some persons who learn the English language, they might learn a particular word that maybe was used years ago, but that now, you know, everything now is quite offensive. You have to be on your P's and Q's about everything these days. So, like, in terms of being politically correct and using certain terminology, you know, so you're not perceived as rude, because you might not know, you know, you might just have learned that word because you learned it years ago, and maybe you don't know how, you know, for example, when I was growing up, you know, persons would use the word retarded, you know, to talk about, but you're not going to hear people like, okay, that child is retarded, you know, they can say, well, he or she has developmental disability, or, you know,
a learning disability,
developmentally challenged. Yeah, something along those lines. So just in terms of knowing those as well, those can, you know, if you're not keeping on top of that, that can trip you up as well. You know, you may make some mistakes there.
Yeah, maybe if you learned your English a long time ago, or you lived in English speaking country a long time. Yeah, it's kind of crazy what maybe used to be acceptable, and that wouldn't, you know, be now. Yeah, if you haven't lived in an English speaking country since the 70s, like, probably like society,
because you're not going to necessarily see it in an English book, but then as you're interacting with persons, you will hear it, whether it's on the news or, you know, in some sort of forum, whether it's on a newspaper article, whatever, on social media, you might see it being written out the more correct way of saying things. So just, you know, but if you look in a dictionary, you might not necessarily see it when you translate the language, you know,
as well.
You might not see the politically correct word. You might just see what the translation was as a standard word that was known years ago. So that can pose a challenge, you know. Even in terms of body language and stuff, all of that, you know, there's so many different components to polite English.
Oh gosh, okay, yeah, wow, it sounds quite, it's more complicated than we realized, but it's good to know, it's good to be aware of. But that's another reason, to keep up with, like, you know, contemporary English, like reading or listening to English as it is today, and not necessarily how it was. Not that you can't enjoy older movies, not all of them, and a lot of them have anything offensive in them, but that's a good thing to be aware of. Okay, so have you got any tips then so you've said there's a lot of components, it's actually quite complicated, it gets worse the better you get at English, right?
Basically that's it.
So what can you do then if you realize, maybe I've been rude, or I'm not sure if I'm being rude, or what kind of things can you do then if you're in this situation? How can you work on it?
I think one of the key components is observing how native English speakers interact with each other. So whether it's in a real life setting, or as we had mentioned earlier with the movies, you know, because usually in a lot of movies, there's usually some sort of interaction setting, whether it's an office setting, or maybe with neighbors. You would see that kind of interaction, especially because I think it's really important to do it with persons, to see the interaction between persons who are not, you know, like best friends or in a relationship or whatever. So looking at those situations, looking at, when they said that, how did the person respond, and taking note of those things, and then trying to obviously, makes no sense knowing you're not implementing them, trying to implement them when you're speaking with others. But I think really observing is the key to seeing how we would interact with each other and then mimicking that basically.
Okay. Yeah, I know I spent a lot of time doing that when I first moved to France, and it's kind of easy because people, they know that you're not a native speaker. They're maybe not expecting so much from you, so you can kind of like, you know, just listen to conversations, and it's not, you know, it's not so bad if you don't contribute so much. But yeah, you do start to notice things quite quickly, but especially the issue of going into shops, you have to adapt to that quite. It sounds so rude now when I think about it. I'm like, why don't we say hello more in shops? Like, why is it not why is it so different? But I mean, it's just different expectations, different culture. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, why not? Why not? It's just the way it works. You know, different. But okay, so there's a lot of so observation is really important. I guess listening is really important then as well, to get used to different intonations, different tones.
Exactly. That's key.
Working on your own pronunciation, I guess, is important.
Because like, as we had mentioned, even if you have the correct sentence and you don't say it with the right intonation, you can still be rude. So yeah, the listening, and then maybe trying to repeat it. I'm not sure if this is something that you encourage a lot, but when I was learning a language, what I would tend to do when I hear something, then I would try to say it out loud, so that I can hear myself saying it back. You know? And trying to mimic how the native speaker said it. And I find that helps a lot.
Yeah, I've definitely done that with often pretty much when I get people to work on dictations after we've done the transcribing part and the correction and everything, then we do work on pronouncing it. And it's actually, it's really interesting to get it as close as possible to the original. I think it really makes you aware. Yeah, and you can easily record yourself nowadays to compare. And I guess if you're working with a teacher, you know, you can ask, like, you know, is there something I still need to work on? Am I close enough? Like, in terms of my intonation, my music, like, does it sound rude? But yeah, even taking, you could have some fun with some short words, short expressions. Yeah, what did you say? Like, going from the most neutral to the most outraged to the most polite, you know, you can, you could really play around with that. Okay, cool. So yeah, but often pronunciation, it's a shame actually, a lot of people, like, they start working more on pronunciation as they get better at English, but in fact, you need to, in any language, you need to work on it from the beginning, because if you ask a question and people don't know it's a question, then
lost in communication.
So even if you put the words in the right order, it's a bit frustrating to find out, like, if you're doing all these grammar exercises and actually, you know, when you speak, your pronunciation and intonation is counts as well a lot for a lot.
Definitely.
Okay. All right, so we need to be keen listeners, keen observers of what's going on around us. I think that's really important in workplaces as well, because I've seen it in France, working in different contexts, like the different expectations. Like, some contexts are more informal, some are a bit more formal. You don't always really know until you arrive. Like, you definitely have to kind of be like, okay.
You have to feel around a bit, to feel.
Yeah, like, even if there's some general rules, like, usually in a French workplace, if you say bonjour all the time and you shake everybody's hand, like, you'll probably be okay. Although, I don't know, when I worked in a university, it's not quite the same. Yeah, it's different, to working in a company. And they even say that, like, in educational settings, everybody uses tu, maybe not with like the dean of the fac or the director of the high school, but other colleagues will do that quite easily. It's pretty informal, whereas when I worked in a company, it was a bit more hierarchical, and even then, that's going to depend on the company. So I guess in every situation you have to
you have to feel it through, because I'm thinking even locally, like the director of the Alliance Française here, when I first met him, I shook his hand, whatever, because we had spoken on the phone before, and we used vous at that time. But then afterwards, when we got and he was like, we're gonna, on va se tutoyer. So then from there, I remember like the second time I saw him, I went to shake his hand, because for me, when I was overseas, like I find the French to shake hands so often.
Yeah, that's it. I would totally shake hands another time with someone like that.
For me, when I'm like, if I meet somebody, you shake their hand, and then usually that's it. I met you, hi. But like, for them, it's almost like a way of saying hello. So then I went to shake his hand, and he was like, so then he gave me his hand, but it was almost like he wasn't expecting it. So I don't know. Sometimes I just find like some situations are so weird, you don't know even how to interact. You just have to feel your way around it. Yeah.
I think it's good when somebody picks up on the cues and they say, for instance, so in French it would be like, we can use tu if you want, that's fine, or are you comfortable with that? And then you don't have to worry about it. But not everybody is so kind of
that's
really sensitive. But yeah, I think it's good when it's the native speaker who says, shall we use first names or or whatever, just some acknowledgement, like it's my job to help you out. But not everybody is like.
It's funny because like I have a parent, her daughter like learns French. Well, she was a previous student, but she learned French with me, and the parent was using vous all of the time, even though we were seeing each other like outside of that in terms of meeting up for other projects outside of like the class time. And I'm like, why is she using vous still? So I decided to ask her about it, well, in English and stuff, because she was really cool. And then she was saying, well, she was doing it as a sign of respect because I'm the girl's teacher.
Okay.
And she was like, but I can use tu if you want. I'm like, yeah, I prefer that. I don't know, like, for me, like, even though I'm a teacher, it's like she's older than me. So like for her to call me vous, I feel really weird when persons are older than me and then they call me vous. Like, I understand you want to respect me, but then to me it kind of creates like a barrier.
Yeah, true. Oh, that can be so complicated. I think sometimes it also just comes down to like personal preferences in some situations. But I'm glad I'm not teaching French and I don't have to deal with this issue, because I think it's really, the basic rules sound really simple, and then it gets very, very complicated. Like so I'm always relieved when somebody says, we can use tu, or they switch to like, okay, that's less stressful.
Yeah.
less to think about. So that's one thing we don't have in English, but we have lots of other.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you want to, so you wrote a book about this to help people basically not come across as rude. So do you want to tell us a bit about your book?
Right. Okay. So the book is the Culture Sensitive Phrase book. And what it does is that it shows you what not to say. And then what would be better ways to say what you're trying to say. And then it's not just a matter of giving you the phrase, but what I tried to do in the book was to explain why you might use the phrase, so that you can understand if you understand why you're doing something, then it makes it easier to commit it to memory, instead of just giving you a phrase, if you know why you're doing something. So I try to use be creative and use humor in the book to kind of get the different points across. So we covered a lot of different areas, for example, making requests, when you're saying no, you're turning down invitations, making like suggestions and giving feedback. So there's the phrase book, and then there's a workbook. So there's no point in just giving a bunch of phrases. Then I have like exercises where I want you to think about if you're in a certain situation. So you put yourself in a certain situation. And I have found persons who would say like, at first they read stuff, but then when they actually try to put themselves in a situation, figure out like, how would I respond in this given situation? So the workbook like has different exercises to kind of cover what I did in the phrase book. So I'm also adding so it's kind of like a toolkit now. So we're also adding like a video. I'm actually going to do a video to add to it about the importance of the intonation, because we talked about that so much and the big role it plays. So just giving persons an idea of how much intonation can make a difference in it. So that will be added to it. So basically this will be kind of your arsenal to be ready and to be polite, when you meet native English speakers.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, I like the idea of like, yeah, it probably is easier to teach with like examples of miscommunication or things going wrong, because it's hard. It's easy when you do something right, like nobody notices, but it's when you do something wrong that
Yeah,
so
exactly.
yeah. I guess in a way, well, that's how we learn anything, and especially languages, is we make mistakes and then we figure out what we're supposed to do instead. But yeah, no, it's good to practice that before you actually
Yeah.
test this out on people. So I really
Yeah.
like the idea of being able actually having to think about it, and then after it will become more automatic. Okay, so I
Yeah.
will include a link to the book wherever this is, and a link to your website.
Right.
Basically all the links will be under this wherever this is. That's what I always like to say. So don't worry, you will find the link. Anything else you want to tell us before we finish off? Anything else we should know?
So just in closing, that even though it might seem daunting, it's attainable. So, just remember to take small steps because, Rome wasn't built in a day. So even though you might be hearing all these things and you might now start to realize that, oh, maybe I've been being rude all of this time, just try to do a few things at a time. Like, okay, maybe I can start to work on making my requests a bit more polite. And, once you've mastered that, then you can go on to other things. So don't look at it as, oh, I have to do so many things now. You start with baby steps and you work your way up until you say that, you're doing pretty well where polite English is concerned.
Okay, all right. Well, that's a relief because yeah, if you had to do everything at once, get your right, get your syntax right to make your request sound polite, like it's a lot. I would say the best thing is to have somebody close to you who is a native speaker who will just say that's rude. But it's not always easy when you arrive in the country. If you can find if you find a romantic partner, or if you have a really close friend, they will probably tell you. But in the absence of that, we have your book, so that's that's a relief. Okay, well, thank you so much, Leandra, for coming on and reminding us and talking about this important topic, which I don't think gets enough attention. So I'm really glad that you could come and talk about that for us. If you're still watching this video, then I suggest that you like it and you subscribe to the channel, which is what I always forget to do. So the links will be underneath this, and there will also be a link to my mini movie guide that you can download for free to learn how to use movies to understand fast talking native English speakers. So thanks again, Leandra.
And thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks everybody for watching. Bye.
Okay then, bye-bye.